The topics we would like to cover today as we lead into the budget process, starting off with looking at the sales tax trends for the city. We'll go into some detail for how the second penny is used. We'll review the debt level of the city. We will present a summary of the capital improvement plans for 2026. We can look at the council priority projects and talk about how we go the next level of detail on those projects. And then finally, we can look at some additional potential revenue sources and get some feelings on which ones we might want to explore further to assist going forward. There are future topics that will be coming up in mid-October, which are really the operational part of the 2026 budget. So today we're really looking at the capital side and some of the long-term planning. I'd like to start out with looking at some sales tax trends. And everybody should have a hard copy at your place. I recognize it could be a little hard to see some of this on the screen. We're starting out looking at our sales tax receipts over time from the beginning of 2021 through July of this year. And there are two lines on the screen. And a couple of you on the council have raised the question before about how much of our increasing sales tax revenues have been inflation driven. And so what we're doing here in the green line is showing the gross sales tax numbers that we measure each month. And as you can see, in the 4.5-year period of time, there's been a pretty substantial growth looking at the linear line in our gross receipts. However, looking at the rust-colored line, which is expressing our sales tax receipts back into the January of 21 dollars, we've been pretty flat in terms of sales tax revenues in the community, meaning that much of our growth the last few years has been driven by inflation. However, I'd like to jump down then to the lower portion of this slide on the left side. This is looking at a comparison of the first 7 months of 24 versus the first 7 months of 25. And we have had a pretty pronounced increase in first and second penny sales tax revenue year over year. And we've seen that in each one of the monthly reports. In fact, we're up almost 7% on a year over year basis. Looking at the same comparison, about 2.6 percentage points of that is driven by inflation. Look, using the Midwest cities under 2.5 million CPI factor, and 4.1% is the real growth. So we have been having a pretty good year in terms of the first and second penny sales tax. As we've built out the capital improvement budget for future years, we have stayed conservative with a 3% growth rate. While we are all happy that we're exceeding what we had put in place, we think it's prudent not to assume that overdriving our sales tax projections is going to continue indefinitely. To get some additional detail in terms of what's driving the sales tax, you can see on the upper right side of the page a comparison for each year in terms of the relative percent of our total sales tax derived from different sectors. The key takeaway is our sectors have been very consistent period over period, with perhaps a percentage point or two change between the various sectors. And so the conclusion there is it's not really a big change in the mix of our economic activity. So we can't put our fingers on any particular segment of the economy and have the ability to say, if we just did more of that, we would have a substantial increase in sales tax activity.
A quick question, not to interrupt. What would be classified as transportation?
So it's a category of transportation and utilities. I believe that utilities makes up the largest portion of that. So it'd be the tax assessed on utility bills each period, which the rates have gone up slightly, would drive some of that. We're actively working with the state to get the next level of detail for each one of these categories, which would break it down by the SIC code. We're not quite there yet. The state's doing another revision for us, which should be very helpful. Councilman Hoyer.
Could you just tie back real quick to the CPI index that you're using and just explain where they get those figures from and why we go with that one versus other models?
Yep. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes several different views of the Consumer Price Index. The one I chose to use for this analysis is an index for Midwest cities with a population under 2.5 million. I believe that to be most fitting compared to some of the other indices out there. Regardless of which CPI measurement you look at, they're all in that 2.5 to 2.7 range. And so I think this is representative of where we've been. We today don't have the ability to precisely take it down to a lower level, but I think this is very representative.
Okay.
Any other questions? So a couple of drivers of sales tax revenue, just to keep in mind as we go through the balance of the conversation, which is largely going to be driven around how we use the second penny of the sales tax to fund long-term capital needs in the city. The biggest driver that we see in long-term growth in sales tax is growth in population, especially the working age population that is going to be also in the consumption era of their careers. Housing construction is tied as well into a sales tax driver, which is also tied into population growth. Without housing, it's tough to grow population, while the construction of houses themselves generate sales tax revenue on a fairly large ticket item. And then we've talked and understood for some time the importance of local commerce and the city being positioned as a place for destination commerce. I will point out in these numbers, all of the numbers that we're looking at, the comparisons are after the effective date of the sales tax law changes from the Wayfair decision. So we are capturing an equivalent share of e-commerce type of transactions in these numbers that we are showing. A fifth category that we don't talk about a lot, but I do want to bring it up because I do think it is a driver in our economy. And it's the use tax that's paid by the manufacturers and wholesalers in the community. So for example, most of our manufacturers are building product for resale, which is never subject to a local sales tax. However, the various consumable products that they use in their manufacturing operations are subject to either a sales tax if purchased locally or a self-assessed use tax if purchased outside of the community. That 2% obviously can grow as that tax base grows, as our manufacturers and wholesalers in the community are healthy and continue with their economic activity. Any questions before we move off of the revenue side of this? Next, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the use of what we often refer to as the second penny. So by way of just background, the first 1% of every sales tax dollar in our community is used to essentially fund the general obligations of our government. So public safety, finance, HR, some of Park and Rec. It's the general obligations of our government. The second cent that is assessed is what's used to fund the capital improvement fund. For some of you who've been around or following the council for some time, you may hear this referred to as the 212 fund. That 212 is just the number in the accounting system. There's nothing special about it. But that second penny is what finances the various hard assets and capital equipment that we plan each year. So looking at the page, you can see the sales tax revenue in 2025 was budgeted at about 10.8 million. We think we'll end the year right around 11 million as we've been trending up. You can see with a 3% growth will be roughly 11 to 11.6 million over the next 3 years. In addition to the sales tax revenue, we have other sources of revenue that are used to fund the capital purchases as well. And those revenues include some money that we get each year from the state through the STP program. We have some intergovernmental transfers that are recognized in the capital fund. We have some small portions that we are able to bring in from the enterprise funds. And that results in an additional roughly 2 to 2.2 million a year. So that shows the total amount of revenue available to spend of roughly 13 to 14 million per year. So how we use the funds, first of all, we start off with our debt service. And we have in the neighborhood of 5 million to 5.4 million a year just servicing the debt that we currently have. We will end this year with about 55 million of debt that is funded by the second penny. That doesn't include the full debt to the city, which we'll talk about in a future slide. And then we classify the other areas of spend into the function of government. The largest share of our spending is in the public works area, which covers our streets. Secondly, our culture and recreational programs is the next largest area, followed by public safety, which mainly includes vehicles for the police and fire service. And then we have some conservation and development, which is really relatively small. And then we have some transfers both in and out of other funds. So pause at that point, just recognizing the fact that we will go into some detail in terms of what we spend in each one of those categories. Any question up to this point?
Do we have any agreements in place with any like developers projects, like a sales tax rebate?
Through the RPP program?
Well, but on the local level.
I don't believe we have any on the local level. The reinvestment payment program at the state level is managed by the state, and I believe the numbers we get each period already reflects that revenue being reduced.
And I was asking around the lines of like some of these, for example, the Craig properties. If we had an agreement with him as the city through the WDC that says if you invest this, we rebate your 2% sales tax for how many years or whatever.
I'm not aware of any. The only program that might be out there, and I don't believe it was used in those projects, would be the state's RPP program, which would already be reduced from our numbers. So I feel fairly confident, looking at Kristen, feel fairly confident that we don't have any surprises in those projects.
I mean, the only thing that was being used was a TIF on the majority of them.
Like another question. On the other revenue line, is it just being conservative in terms of what we're seeing for 26, 27, and 28 being less than 25?
We have to look at the detail of that. There is a large portion that's actually interest income. And so we get a spread. We've invested some dollars at above the coupon rates of the bonds. As we spend down those dollars, I think the interest income goes down, but I'll look to our CFO for a definitive answer.
Yeah, the only other thing in 2025, part of why that looks as high as it does is we had quite a few of the projects that made it in that were getting grant funding. Some of our rec trails and some other projects. So that right there, the other revenue is STP interest, and then also the cash from the donations for the ice arena.
So
that's pretty flat is what we would expect.
So we count grants as revenue?
We do.
City managers. I'm sure if you're going to go into more depth, just say so. But with conservation development, I mean, you kind of guess at what that is, but maybe just explain a little further, since it is the only figure up there that stays flat in the coming years.
It's actually the GIS investment that we've made. The Geographical Information System.
So with conservation and development, it's nothing else in that area. It's
There's
literally
not.
just GIS. Okay. It's not what I thought it was then.
Yeah, and I recognize these descriptions could be a little confusing. We're trying to follow the functions of government taxonomy that the state puts forward. And we may need to do a little session or give a work paper on what's actually in them for you.
I'll just add another example of like if we ever would have some type of development projects that we were contributing to, that is where it would go. Same thing like when we've done improvements at the wellness center, or not the wellness center, the event center. Stuff like that falls into that. When we've improved our own buildings, that's that conservation and development side.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just when I saw the conservation, I thought maybe it's something with forestry, something.
Well, and when we used to have the Upper Big Sioux,
Sure.
anything that was related to that went into that category.
Next, go ahead.
Sorry, last thing. I'm loving all this. Could we get like a schedule of our TIFs and when they're gonna be paid off as well?
We can.
Thank you. That'd be helpful.
I'd like to call everyone's attention to a line item in 2026 called street facility transfer out. As the team and I have looked at our second penny revenues and looked at our unallocated fund balance, we do believe that we could allocate 3.5 million of fund balance to a new street facility in 2026. That would still leave us a pretty healthy fund balance at 4.4 million. The way to view that fund balance is that is cash planned to be on hand that doesn't have a current allocated purpose. And past councils have tried to always keep that at $5 million or higher. You will see in 2027, due to the timing of projects, we do dip down to 4.3 million. Again, this is funds available, not allocated to any specific project. So I would feel comfortable on a short-term basis being at the $4 million level, and our CFO would also feel comfortable at that level. So what that means is if as a council you are comfortable at that level, with funds available, we could allocate $10.6 million to the construction of a street facility without raising any additional debt to complete the facility. That would be a facility, 10.6 million for approximately a 50,000 square foot facility would be a little bit over $200 a square foot. For that type of facility, I think would be a doable level of spending that would still allow us to do a wash bay in the mechanics bays. Keep in mind, this doesn't include the money we've already put into the land and some of the infrastructure on the site, which would increase the overall total project cost. This is just funding to finish the project and allow us to vacate the current buildings that we have. Any questions?
Where do you anticipate will be in terms of total funding?
Let us come back to you. I have a number in mind, but remember we've been talking about land sales that offset it and how do we allocate the infrastructure we've already put in. My rough estimate would be is it's not more than 2 million net. So we paid 1.2 million for the land, maybe another million in infrastructure. We're offsetting that with land sales and assessments. So not more than 2 million would be a number I'd be comfortable with. This proposal would allow our debt service to decrease to about 38% of our revenues in 2029. In the past, the council has targeted to try to stay below 40%. And so this gets us the ability to create a large-scale project and also manage the debt level and the debt service at a level that the CFO would be comfortable with. Any questions?
I like that last point you made. It'd be nice to get to that, at least get close.
Yeah.
What kind of bond would that be for the street facility?
It wouldn't be a bond.
3% down.
This is a method that we could do without additional bonding for a street facility. So we do have some debt that we already have because the last bond, we borrowed money to complete the ice arena and a street facility and a city hall project. We have 7.1 million currently sitting invested from those bond issuances several years ago. I believe that's a coupon rate of, is it about 4%? Currently sitting there that we're servicing. We do have some IRS guidelines on when we need to spend that money. I believe it's by early 2027. And we also have some restrictions on how we can invest that money because they are municipal bonds. And the 3.5 million would be other cash on hand. So the total amount for the facility without new debt would be 10.6 million. Does that help?
So this will be for another subject, or another day, but whole street department. But yeah, I've looked forward to how we're getting to that number versus where we were. So, but that's fine for another day. But I appreciate your work on it.
Full disclosure, we're not at that number yet.
Right.
We've had some conversations with people who have developed buildings in the neighborhood of that number. And we've conceptually talked about what we would like in a facility. But with some guidance from the council, we will then go and try to turn it into a real set of numbers with some real commitments. Move on to our actual debt level itself. This is the $55 million of debt that we will have related to 212 projects as of the end of 2025. Now, the overall debt level of the city also includes some loan debt related to wastewater of, I think at the end of the year will be about 20 million. And also some municipal utilities debt of about 7 million to represent the total debt level of the city. However, the last two categories, the wastewater and the municipal utilities, that debt isn't serviced through sales tax. That debt is actually serviced through charges on utility bills. So as we look at just the sales tax debt, we don't have a major debt maturity until 2035. And those are bonds that were issued in 2020. They're actually bonds refunding some earlier bonds at a lower interest rate. And at that point, our annual debt service will go down to less than $3 million, assuming we don't raise any more debt. And that would put us at 20% of revenues, or about half the level that we said we would be comfortable with. Also, there have been some questions about trying to pay down debt. Our first opportunity to do that is next year. It is a very small issuance of about $900,000 that we could call. We would incur fees in doing that. I don't recommend that we do that because that debt is currently at about a 2% rate. And so it makes sense to continue with that debt level. One thing we might look at is trying to restrict some of the interest earnings that we have on our cash versus the coupon rate on the bonds. And we could perhaps restrict some of the excess earnings to be used exclusively for future debt repayment. Something we could look at. Any questions on the overall debt level and the path of pay down of the debt? Okay, now we're going to switch gears just a little bit. So we've been talking conceptually, and we've looked at our debt level if we do nothing different in the future and how eventually that debt will tail off. We will be coming back to you with the details of a 10-year plan for capital spending. But for now, I'd like to just walk through some of the details of our plan for 2026. You recall we've got our different functions of government. And so we start with the public works portion. And we are planning a single project next year that will be a $3.1 million project to reconstruct Fifth Avenue North. That large project will consume most of what we typically would spend on streets. So as the team and I looked at CIP for next year, we have found ways to push out and defer spending in other areas so that we could put an additional $874,000 into street spending next year. So we didn't like the idea of doing only a single project. And if we have things that we need to fix and maintain on roads after a harsh winter, we wanted to have some funds available to do that. Our next major area of spending is our recreational improvements. And we have some trail projects that are ongoing and we'll move into next year with those projects of $350. We have a large park in the River Ridge development that is under process right now. There'll be an additional $250,000 in the program to complete that park next year. And then finally, we have a series of projects related to the zoo, so that over the course of the next 3 fiscal years, we will have completed the projects necessary to address the issues raised in the accreditation report. And so $200,000 is the largest portion of those projects for next year. We also have some of the recurring spend items that we do, the 3 patrol cars that we do each year. We don't have a major fire service investment next year. That will be in here. And so mainly it's public works projects, including streets and a little bit of drainage that we have programmed in for next year's capital spending plan. If you would like, we could look at some more detail of the list, or we can circulate that list to the group so you can see the individual projects. However, those of major significance we've already commented on. Any questions on the CIP plan?
Just one question. Do you think we might, in our facilities assessment that we're going to do that won't probably be done until next spring, do you anticipate we'll discover anything that we must deal with there that would change?
I think we will, but I think it will be too late to accomplish those projects in 2026. And as we did the program review for 2027, we are anticipating at least one large project. Dusty, you'll have to help me the amount. I think it's 1.5.
1.75.
Yeah. So we've got some that we know are coming. And the nice thing about having that report is we'll be able to look a little further into the future and see what else could be coming.
I would have a question on the street system improvements. So first off, thanks for collectively agreeing to find some money for ongoing maintenance on other places other than Fifth Avenue North. So is that Fifth Avenue Northwest, East?
It's northwest.
Okay. And just wondering where we will be in upcoming years after that, because I know that, because Justin, you and your team have like the really big street reinvestments, you know, like the completely redos, you've got those mapped out for years ahead of time, don't you?
Yeah, we have kind of a tentative plan for the next 10 years.
I guess what I was curious about is, do we have another big project that's going to soak up the majority of the street funds in upcoming years? Because the ongoing maintenance of the existing streets is also something that I think should be important.
We will have 2 future slides where we can address that topic if it's okay, including new sources of revenue to try to stay ahead of the streets. So if you're okay, I'll maybe jump to the next slide and we'll address that. So the next slide, I have gathered the council priority projects with the ranking that the last council applied to these projects. And as a staff, we could use some help here. We'd like to get into some more detail on what you as the new council would like to do with some of these projects. What I'd like to propose is we can group some of them into master projects. But I'd like to get some cohorts of 2 or 3 council people that are passionate about some of these projects that we can work with to further scope them out. And I also would recommend that we maybe remove some from the list as well. It's tough to move forward with 19 priorities. And as we'll walk through here, you can see of these 19 priorities, only one has any programming consideration in our 10-year capital plan. So as you see some of these, if there's a team you'd like to be on, or I can follow up with each one of you individually, really looking for some subject matter experts that have some passion on helping us scope these projects with a little more degree of clarity. In addition, there are 2 other projects that the staff and I have identified that we should talk about. And they weren't on the council priority projects largely because I think they maybe came up after the previous council had met. So we can have some discussion on those. But just walking through these, and you'll see that many of them, we don't have an estimate on the dollar amount. And some of these as a project, we might consider grouping together things that we want to dispose of or to cease investment in. And that may be a project in and of itself to determine what we want to stop offering of the various amenities that we have. So looking at the top, we've talked about the street maintenance facility. Some help from a work group on that one would be to look at what we can buy for 10.6 million. And if as a council and a staff, we feel like 10.6 million doesn't get us enough, we can either look at programming this over multiple years and determining how we can use the 212 fund, or we can look at perhaps we do need to bond a portion of that project to be able to spend some more to get the right facility. What I think we're all settled in on is a $20-some million facility seems to be much more than the staff would want or need. The East Side Fire is the next council priority that's out there. We don't have anything in the CIP for funding on this particular project, either on the capital side or the operations side. In a slide or two, we'll talk about some potential new sources of financing. This may be a project that we look at some grant funding on the capital side and some new sources of revenue on the operational side to be able to accomplish this. Big Sioux flood control. This is the local portion of the less expensive option that was presented by the Corps. As that project gets pushed out in terms of the issuance of the report, I don't know that the report that we reviewed 90 days ago is going to be the final report. And so it's in here as a placeholder. We don't know what the project or the funding needs will be on that yet. Housing is a priority, but we don't have a city dollar amount associated with that. And there are various things we could do in terms of contributing land that we already have that wouldn't require a cash outlay. We have working groups looking at grant opportunities. This also may be an area where, in collaboration with the Watertown Municipal Utilities, we look at new sources of revenue to try to develop the infrastructure. The old City Hall redevelopment, I think, can come off the list. We're largely on our way there. Item number 6 was a Cattail Crossing Clubhouse. That's a very rough number that Dusty and I just programmed in here. Again, that one could really utilize a working group to look at do we need it, and when do we need it, and how do we finance it? The baseball stadium, I know we've got that, first of all, to take a step back, that is not our facility. That's not our stadium. That currently is the school district's facility. We are in the beginning the second year of a 3-year agreement on a lease of the facility. The school would like us to take it over. We have user groups that would like us to take over that facility and invest in it. We believe it might require $1 to $1.5 million of investment, with a user group who would be very engaged in raising funds. But as we walk through at least funding it from a second penny sales tax, we don't have the capacity in the near term to do that. Event center improvements, although we have a tenant in the facility required to make certain investments, we do know that the revenues of the event side of the facility mean that that tenant is unlikely to make those investments. We also need to look at, is it viable for us to make investments at that level for the revenue that's generated in the facility? Again, a working group would be great. The Mace facility, we have a working group, and there is some proposals that I think we'll see real soon. And I think those proposals will be a city outlay of far less than $1 million. Or zero. That's even better.
Just to make it clear to council, that working group for the Mace does not have any councilmen on it, nor am I on it. That was a working group put together by Dusty, but bringing together every single entity that had interest. And I had a quick conversation with Dusty. It sounds like he's got a really good plan to bring forward to us, or at least some really good ideas.
Needs to get it operational.
As we look at the auditorium and also the eastern streets of 31st Street and 3rd Avenue, we don't have those projects scoped yet, but they were on the priority list. A 50-meter pool. Again, there may be a user community that has some interest in that and in some fundraising. At this point, we haven't invested much time at all in trying to determine what the investment would be required there. We also know we have gravel roads throughout the community that need some investment. Repurposing the water treatment plant was a priority. Sidewalk program. The buy down debt, I'd recommend that we perhaps remove from the list for this reason. We showed that we don't have debt in a favorable position to try to call early. But we could rescope it to be invest additional interest income in a potential buy down when the time comes. I think Foundation Plaza was a recommendation to do a sheet of ice. Again, we don't really have a team organized around that, but we could put one together. And Compesca weeds, I'm not even sure what that is. So if you've seen things on here that you want to have some discussion about removing in the near term, we'd be happy as a staff to take them off. You want to get a few small groups together to look at these in some more detail before making the call on a few of these, that I think is fine as well. I'll take your guidance. Councilman Hoyer?
I'll toss out the groups out at the lake. There's already been, I believe, 2 companies now that have purchased weed removal equipment. And so I think that's been addressed. You can probably remove it. It sounds like it's been kind of hit on the private side.
And also, just to make something clear, I saw a few justifiable smiles when the list of 19 subjects came up. And that was really, when this was done, I wanted to make sure that any idea that anyone could think of was brought to the table so that nobody could ever contend that we weren't considering everything and prioritizing it for the betterment of the community. With that said, I would also agree that there's several on here that should be taken away, and we need to refocus. I would say get the list down. I'm not even going to shoot for a specific number, but I think
Do we know?
I just wanted to clean it up a little bit, because when, well, first year as mayor, we still had some things on the list that nobody had any idea about where they even came from or when they were put on. So we wanted to clean that up at least and come up with the actual plan. Sorry, Michael.
No, you're good. I kind of jumped in, but I was just going to ask, do we have a plan for when we want to sit down and address these things and have that discussion? I think it's beneficial if we avoid making it into an email stream and just sit down and talk about it sometime.
I would agree, and I would also think it might be better to. I'm a little cautious about this because I don't want. I would just.
It'll get dramatic. I mean,
Yeah, I just don't want. I don't want someone to in a user group to take offense if we don't prioritize something according to the high importance that they place on it. And a discussion of that could result in some unnecessary hurt feelings if it's done too publicly. So I think, some smaller groups getting together to talk, getting back to Alan, facilitated by Alan or a staff member, I'd be happy to help set things up. I just don't want, I want us to be able to have a conversation and then go out and get the information we need to fully make the decision, rather than have it unnecessarily swayed by the emotion of people who might be very close to it.
That's a very, very fair way of looking at it. What I would say is I'd like to get some cohorts formed to do a deeper dive into a few of these, and that may turn into the 2-on-1 or 3-on-1 council groups that I'm looking forward to as well. But I'll say this, I would like some guidance and leadership and thought leadership from the council on these priority projects so that we as staff can go run some of the detail. But I also want to be very cognizant of this. You go way back and think about the first slide that I showed with fairly flat sales tax revenues over the last 5+ years. I'd like staff to support each of you as council members so that you can be working on the real important things, which are driving population growth of workforce in the community supported with housing. And some of these smaller projects with a little bit of guidance, I don't know that we need you each day to day thinking about a clubhouse. Now you can give your thoughts and guidance in terms of where it fits from a priority, but we'll go off as a staff to work with that. What we can't do as well as a staff is attract people to the community and make them feel welcome in the community and have all the community resources around that they want to stay here. That, I think, is the higher calling that we need from the council. I added 2 projects. One is we've been going through a whole series of issues in the Highland neighborhood with the rain we've had this year. We have a plan proposed to address all the drainage issues in that neighborhood, which was built 50 or 60 years ago without any underground storm conveyance facilities in it. In 2021 dollars, it was a $9 million project. And I don't know how to fund that. And so we may need to go back and say, is there a middle ground that will give the homeowners there some relief? Councilman Hoyer.
Well, I just want to tie back to the history of that a little bit. I mean, that was 2021, right? That we talked about that because we had discussed that the pipe size essentially is too small. It needs somewhere to go. It would connect kind of over by the Mount Hope area, kind of. And then we talked at one point of like retention pond along 81.
You're remembering it right.
Okay.
And the issue is, for a large portion of that neighborhood, there is no underground conveyance of water until it reaches Highland Park. And so there's nothing upstream. So the water today is flowing through the streets that have curbs that are about 3 inches high and backyards that have no curbs. And it's all overland flow of water. The street maintenance schedule, as the city engineer and I have looked at street maintenance needs, we've been spending $3.5 to $4 million a year, which is a dramatic improvement over where it was just a few years ago. However, to really follow some of the guidelines for the miles of street that we have and for the replacement value of the streets, theoretically, we should be spending in excess of $6 million a year. And Justin can make additional comments on that. He's got quite a bit of detail behind it, supporting where that number comes from. And today, in the absence of additional revenue, we don't have a way to program in an additional $2 million of spend a year on streets.
So then does this tie back to perhaps that as we're looking at all these priorities, we need to look at them through the lens and scope of how do we drive more revenue growth, which is actually just population growth, as previously on the first slide. I mean, that seems to be the consistent issue that we have to drive anyway. And so finding those things that really do support what brings people to our community, what makes them feel comfortable, what makes things like housing affordable, getting those younger families in, and then what drives that.
Exactly right. So I think we've been growing our population about 1% per year. And that's about double what it might have been the first 2 decades of the millennium. However, at some point, I think to achieve the goals we're trying to achieve around workforce, or we're looking at with housing and our sales tax growth, we would like to approach a 3% growth rate, which won't happen overnight. Put it into perspective as we look at other cities across the state. Spearfish, for example, has been growing at about a 3% rate. And that seems to be a sweet spot for growth in population that can fund the sales tax related projects while not overwhelming a community with the double-digit growths that some of the Sioux Falls metro area communities we're seeing. So I think as we put together the council's vision and continue to work forward, that 3% target's a good target.
You go ahead, Kyle.
Well, I'll switch the subject, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think as we continue to look at that, maybe we need to, and I'm sure that Brandy's in here. Yep. Okay. That as we continue to go forward, looking at minimum lot requirements, things like that, how can we compress housing but not make it crowded, but find more effective use of our roads so that we're not building so many roads, so that we're not creating a bigger problem that we have to maintain, and how can we maybe do some infill and stuff as well, which I know some developers have been doing in our community, but really getting creative with how we develop as well.
All great points, including what are the design standards for roads in terms of street width and the classifications of roads and materials and base type. Councilman Peters?
I was just gonna go back to that Highland drainage for a second here, because I think this is good context. Expensive project, but I think it's worth noting that the utilities are gonna go through, rip up the street and put new water pipe in much of that road, if not all of that road. And so I think it would be helpful, and I didn't know that till we walked the neighborhood that day. That starts to justify the upgrades in that area for me very quickly. If we're tearing up the road and putting in a new water line, it wouldn't make any sense to have them repair the road just for us to go tear it up again. So it'd be nice to understand what other areas the utilities are looking at doing some of those projects. Because to me, this only tells so much of the story. When you see the Highland drainage at $9 million, it's very scary. But then when you start understanding that, well, how can we work together with the utilities more to kill 2 birds with 1 stone?
I think that's a great point, and we should be looking at their 10-year plan as well and making sure we're programmed with it. I will also say this from a staff perspective. As the issues have intensified in that neighborhood this year, we've looked at some things that weren't even part of the scope put together, the 2021 plan, that may give us some quick wins, like acquiring a couple of properties to put a channel or underground conveyance between two blocks, coupled with some curb and gutter, coupled with some channel cleanup, may get us enough relief to get water to the Highland system quickly enough. That gives us a chance then to wait or explore other means downstream from Highland. If I remember right, Justin, the downstream from Highland is the most expensive part of the 9 million.
Highland Park and was that 4th Street? I think it's the most
Okay.
expensive. I think that's, if I remember right, it's like 48 pipe or something like that.
Okay.
Pretty big pipe.
Can you place that, Justin? Is that like south of St. Martin's? Like, is that where we're kind of talking?
Be from the northeast
Yeah.
corner of Highland
That's right.
Park
Yep.
going to, yeah.
St. Martin's
Yep,
is the one.
okay.
I was trying to figure out which direction. It's from Highland Boulevard.
And actually past 81 to the east a little bit. That includes that, I think.
No, I think we stopped at
Just
81.
81.
So the utilities, they wouldn't, when they are patching the street, they're only taking half of the street. How much of the street, I mean, maybe that isn't a question we can answer. I'm just curious how much they're actually ripping up when they're putting in that water line.
It's about half the street. That's what
Yeah.
they're planning to do.
Because that's what they did with First Avenue South here downtown, just half the road when they did that.
Half the street and none of the curb and gutter, which is the
Good problem.
critical part. It's the grade of the curb and gutter. The next and final slide.
Councilman Allen?
Sorry.
Shifting once again, can you help me understand repurposed water treatment?
So we have a water treatment plant on Lake Compesca that was first repurposed as a phosphorus removal facility. It's sitting there unused right now, and staff has had various suggestions for what we do with it, from perhaps building a clubhouse, which the golf team doesn't really think is the best place for a clubhouse, to do we try to have it redeveloped for housing or to sell the property? At this point, we don't know, other than it's an asset sitting there doing nothing on Lake Compesca.
Fucking where it cuts the trees out, great fishing spot.
We could back up a minute too on that priority project. One item on the Foundation Plaza Ice, I mean, unless there's a user group that's maybe driving something. I remember having the conversations when we approved that project. Should we prepare for ice, not put ice in? It was going to cost us much more if you do it later. As a council, we saved about $1 million, I believe, give or take, not putting ice in. We're only, 2 years into that project being done. Unless we have a surplus of funds, I don't know if it's wise to try to add something that's just only 2 years old that it's going to cost another $1 million. Just a thought on that particular project. Just how, because we made that decision, right, wrong, or indifferent 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So I don't know if that really is sensible. The ice at the Foundation Plaza, is it sensible to try to, a couple years removed, put ice back in again? So
Just depends how you're viewing it. If you think it's an amenity that can drive sales tax, maybe it's worthwhile. If you don't think it's going to make that big of a difference and we can come up with some other thing to do in the winter, then maybe that's viable.
right, like
You know, that's kind of our challenge, is that, like, you know, could we put a giant Christmas tree there? And that's where the giant city Christmas tree is.
Right.
Just do things that help develop culture.
Right.
But
I don't know if there's if there's other
I think-
groups with the new ice arena. We got ice choices, so
A few different things that could perhaps change our discussion on the Foundation Plaza and also the downtown improvements, because I could see the Foundation Plaza being looped into downtown discussion. But if the Ruins building ever gets finished, we have a space there that we paid for, reserved to have skate rentals, or, basically just a room that the city can have for storage, along with the bathrooms. And until that building is done, there's really not much reason to discuss. I suppose we could have a plan for if the building ever does get done, we can move fast. But that's something to consider.
Good. One final slide, and the final slide is new revenue possibilities. 90 days into this, I was a bit hesitant for whether or not I should put this forward. But I do think it's important that you as a council and we as a staff start to talk about other opportunities that other communities are doing. Because other communities are growing. They're growing their population, they're growing their tax base, and they're attracting people. We are growing, but not at a rate that's fast enough to drive the sales tax base to do all the things we need to do, much less all the things we want to do. And so I think it's good to take a look at these. I'm not advocating any single one of these as something we should or should not do. This is to inspire some thoughts. And there are additional things we might want to put on the list too. For example, maybe we go right out and put a population growth rate on as a new revenue opportunity. But just looking at this, the staff and I have talked through these, and I think it's good for familiarization for the council to know some things that are out there and what the potential range might be. So I'll take just a couple minutes to walk through each one. The first one is a street frontage assessment. This one we've done some of the background work on. Most communities of the first class in the state have some sort of street frontage assessment. It's used to provide additional funds for the maintenance of streets. It takes some of the pressure off the second penny at $1.75 per linear foot on an average lot of 75 feet. It would cost the taxpayer about $131 annually. Second one is a stormwater assessment. We believe we could raise between $800,000 and $1 million annually. This would be a flat rate or a user fee placed on a utility bill. Residential bill would be about $3 per month. We would use this to fund improvements and enhancements in stormwater infrastructure. Looking at this and just taking the Highland neighborhood, it would take us 9 years to cover that project with this type of assessment. So I don't think it is the end all, but this would allow us to do some of the smaller things where we have problems. We have different alleyways that could use a small investment in drainage that we don't have a way to fund today that this could take care of for us. A fire/medical district. This is an interesting one. Our fire and ambulance service is gaining call volume outside of the city limits. And that's happening as many of the volunteer departments are not fully staffed. And our range and call volume is increasing. And this is really trying to peg a fee with the areas that we do service. We do from the surrounding townships today get a fire protection fee. It's about $5,000 a township, so it's a very minimal number. What we don't have today is, especially on the 80% of our call volume related to medical or ambulance calls, we don't have a funding mechanism from the surrounding areas in the county at all. In fact, from an ambulance service standpoint, the providers at both the state and federal level view us as a transportation company, not necessarily a medical service. And that's real tough to continue to fund the investments we've made as a community into the ambulance service that we have. You know, just by way of background, we took delivery of an ambulance the week before last. It is now a $451,000 asset. We have 5 of them and they last about 10 years. So just kind of do that on a per call basis and recognize that many of our calls have no funding mechanism at all other than the second penny sales tax. Now, I think it's important to notice that people outside of the community pay the second penny sales tax as well, but it does cost us more to service the areas outside of the city limits than it does within the city limits. And so looking at a very specific fee that would allow us to at least fund the operations cost of expanding to a third station is what we would propose in this fee. The chief has worked through a couple of models looking at a 40 cents per $1,000 evaluation for property outside of the city limits. Now, we'd also need to look at financing a station itself, and we could look at either grants, a general obligation bond, or continuing to utilize sales tax revenues on an actual facility. So I've said a lot on this one because I think of all the things we're looking at, it's probably one of the most important things that we have if we want to continue to provide medical services that we are. If we're viewed as purely a transportation company by the insurance companies and the governmental organizations that fund us, we're the equivalent to a FedEx. FedEx isn't going to save the lives of somebody in the county. So I do think we need to look at this a little different. Councilman Hoyer.
I was just curious, what is the farthest distance that we go to service for ambulance call?
Service 785 square miles, basically Will County. God.
So like, what's the furthest distance an ambulance is going to go on a trip?
Well, that's
Not counting if it goes to Sioux Falls or something like that.
good question. Non-interfacility, if it's a 911 call, we will go to the very northwest up by Wallace, all the way past northeast to South Shore. But more importantly, if there's a ambulance service within the region that needs to come to Watertown, we will go out into Hamlin County. We'll go into Clark County, Day County, Grant County specifically as well.
So like an 80-mile round trip, essentially.
I would say the most, Councilman Hoyer, is probably 40 miles, 35, 40 miles one way, but not a lot of times that happens.
Sure. I'm just like going back to these vehicles being the expense that they are, putting the extra miles on them, the extra wear and tear. When we're in the winter, these are country roads, so we're taking additional risk and putting our professionals in additional risk for it too. It's just getting those factors and considering them as well, which is also what makes us not transportation.
Councilman Hoyer, I'd also add that the chief and his team are looking at adding a non-transport fee next year as well. Large number of our calls, we don't transport anybody to the hospital. We treat on site. We incur expense to do that. It's just in a capital allocation to roll the bus out of the station is $250, not counting the staff. Chief, I don't know what percentage of your calls we don't transport, but if we don't transport, we don't have
20%.
revenue.
At least 20%.
Pretty significant.
I think people realize that we bring a highly trained medical service to their homes. And I think there is some times I think that they know that, and it becomes, we get the routine calls. That might be the term I want to use. But obviously when somebody calls 911, we have an obligation to respond. We know that when we get there, if we treat, a lot of times they know we cost money as well. So we try to do everything in our power to get them to go to the hospital, cheerlead a little bit, because it's more likely than not they need more medical professional help than us. So, but he's correct. It's, even if we don't transport, we're talking probably $250 for us to go to that house.
Right. I'm just considering if they had gone to the ER or quick care, like what that would have cost them instead. And is it a way to avoid that or not? And not that somebody would do that, but just weighing in the factors.
Good point.
But what I will say to close out the fire and medical discussion is it really is a statewide issue. And I anticipate before the legislature this year, there'll be some debate and proposals brought forward, because it's not just Watertown Fire Rescue that's taking on more of a regional role without funding. It's happening elsewhere in the state and will be paying close attention to it.
Yeah, South Dakota doesn't deem ambulances essential service like they do for fire protection. Hence, there's a lot of unfortunate services across the state that are suffering, and that's why the volunteer services are not able to provide that anymore. Of course, we lost South Shore as a volunteer fire ambulance service here around 2 years ago, I believe, and they asked us to take on that region up there in the townships. So Grant County's asked me to take on some of their area as well, and I'm trying to push the brakes a little bit, knowing that this becomes more and more difficult for us to do. So.
Well, and I'm wondering too, with the increase of challenge that some of the rural healthcare facilities are going to be facing here in the next coming years, if this is going to just grow to be a bigger issue for us.
It definitely will. It's a different world we're living in for technology when it comes to ambulance providers, because we bring a higher level of care, and a lot of people know that. So.
The next item I have on the list is utility infrastructure debt as a potential revenue source. And as several of you alluded to earlier this afternoon, we can work much more closely with Watertown Municipal Utilities than we have, and that's a goal and desire of mine to do so. But things such as digging up streets twice or dealing with curb stops and all of the type of debate and issues that we have, we still treat each other as though we are too far apart and too separate. And I think as we look at the overall financing of needs within the city, this is another one where I'd recommend that you as a council and as a independent utility board periodically sit down and make sure that you're strategically aligned and going in the right direction for the community. So what I would share is the debt level on Watertown Municipal Utilities is about $7 million. Compare that to the soon to be $80 million that we have on the city that we're struggling to finance through sales tax revenue. It really does mean we've pushed a lot of debt onto the sales tax taxpayer. And the return for that has been good. The return is we've got the lowest utility rates anywhere. But maybe they're too low. And maybe we've kept the rates so low that we've failed to make the investments on the utility side that should be made. That's not an editorial opinion, it's just an observation. You guys as a council with your partners on the utility board, I think have to have those difficult discussions. But I will say that it's not unusual for other utilities to have a much higher level of debt, which allows them to do things such as to advance infrastructure and new developments that allow for housing growth to happen at a more rapid pace, to allow population growth to happen, to allow sales tax growth to happen. It's not all of the answer, but it's something I think should be on the table to look at in a collaborative manner. The next item is user fees. This is just one example, but to ensure that we have a user fee structure that's aligned with services that we provide. At the staff level, we went through our fee ordinance this afternoon, and there's quite a few fees on there. Nobody knows how they were ever derived. We're in the business of buying and reselling stuff. We have fees on there. We're not even sure where they came from. But trying to find out areas where we do have a burden on sales tax revenues that are specific to certain areas, such as one that Chief Toomey and I have looked at, is our cost of animal control. And the request for support of the Humane Society continues to be a need that we struggle to meet. We're the only city of size in the state that does not have a pet license fee. That's a pretty easy one where we put a pet license fee in place. It doesn't have to be an extreme fee, but it allows us to fund those services. Perhaps it's a reduced fee if there's a microchip in the animal so that our police are not taking a bunch of time trying to find the owner of an animal that can't be traced. So just one example there. I'd like to talk about a general obligation bond. We have not had a general obligation bond outstanding in our community for about 5 years now. The last one was the bond issued to build the event center in the early 2000s. A general obligation bond is a bond that is serviced by property tax revenues and not by sales tax revenue. Similar to the utility infrastructure debt, one of the ideal things about a bond that's serviced through either property taxes, meaning a consistent, stable flow of revenue to finance the bond, or utility bill, which again is a consistent, stable flow of revenue versus the fluctuating sales tax. These are much more preferable bonds to go issue to the bondholders. If we went back just to the 2022 mill levy, which is the dollars per thousand evaluation assessed by the city, we could generate $1.2 to $1.5 million annually. As we've held the line on our property tax ask to be 3% or less, our mill levy has been going down year after year. Our proposed levy that you guys passed at the last council meeting is $1.54 per thousand. That compares to $2.04 per thousand in 2022. So from a taxpayer standpoint, especially as the property tax base grows, this isn't a big ask, but the return is pretty substantial. It gives us that stable recurring revenue to do things like build an East Side fire station, although this is much more than we need to do that. So another pool of revenue to look at. And then finally, I think we've got more opportunities to leverage grant funding for larger projects. We've been pretty successful on the small stuff. For example, the grant that we have for the drug impairment enforcement that was approved at the last council meeting of about $30,000-$40,000. We're real good at finding those. We can get better at finding the big ones, the ones that could service facilities such as a community development block grant, which would be targeted around the census tracts with low and mid income that we have in our community. The grant programs are set up specifically to finance those types of needs. And we're just starting to explore what options we have available there. So I'll be honest, this took some courage to put forward to you guys, but I think this is important to start to change the conversation about what we're trying to do in a community. Because in many cases, with the reliance that we have on sales tax revenue, which can be cyclical, we've all seen that. We as a staff come to you oftentimes saying, I don't know where it's going to come from. We think, we feel. And I think we'd better service our citizens if we had a more diverse set of revenue financing what we're trying to do than just relying on sales tax alone. So with that, that concludes the presentation. I'd love to hear your feedback and questions on anything we've gone through.
Let's go, Councilman Allen.
Just on the GO bond end of things, it would seem to me that what we decided to do with that would be really important to the citizens of Watertown. So you said the last time it was for the event center. And I think the question would be, have we gotten a return on investment for that GO bond? And I don't know how people would answer that. I don't know what the answer to that would be myself. I mean, obviously we're looking at it now and saying, boy, we maybe need to invest another $1 or $2 million. That's a significant investment. So I just would say, in terms of GO bond, I think that's certainly a revenue source we should look at. But I think what we do with it would be really important.
think that's a great observation, and I think if we were to look at a GO bond, we'd want to look at the public safety sector, or perhaps even significant street projects, where the public sees that not necessarily direct financial return, but they see the greater benefit.
Councilman Hoyer?
I was gonna say, like, I feel that my initial reaction to most of it, and even when it comes to more assessment or taxation on anything, is maybe a focus on the choice of it. Choosing to have a pet can trigger a pet license. Choosing to have a bigger frontage with your home will incur more expense. More of that versus, like, I always get a little put off by the general obligation, because that absolutely should go to a public vote, obviously. But things just being slapped on you when it's already hard right now, and things are only getting more expensive right now. I feel like giving that little bit of choice and decision on the user group's part kind of helps make it more of something that's stomachable when we approach these things, versus, it's just us saying, hey guys, we're going to tax you more. We think it's for a better good, but, like, arguably the event center has had positive things, but I don't know if we're making a bunch off it, and we've clearly fallen behind on maintenance. So how'd that go? I just want us to be intentional with it, and just know that, for that older couple or someone who has a fixed income, it gets really hard when we start putting extra expenses on them that maybe they didn't foresee. But that's usually the reason I think we have our hangups with adding a lot of these anyway. But if it's with choice, then maybe it's a little more doable. But I remember a few of these being very unpopular the last time we talked about them, but they do need to be discussed. And then again, just be more intentional maybe with how we develop going forward to avoid some of these extra strains that we put on ourselves, because we do have a large number of roads that have nothing on them that go to single flagpole things. And that's not a great model for building when you're trying to avoid creating infrastructure expense. So, got a lot of things to look at.
Yeah. So about a year ago, I brought this up previously and still even today, but the earlier part of your presentation helps this conversation, because I'd mentioned, or my thought was that I would not be for some of these couple items, for example, street frontage or stormwater, some of these added assessments, unless we are being good stewards of what we currently had. And not that I'm not saying anything about anybody in particular, just our numbers being at 50-some% debt ratio. I like to see us try to, not how we got there, but how can we improve that and make sure we're being good stewards of getting that number down, which you've shown a possible model, right? How we can do that. So if we're being good stewards of trying to, that's one thing to keep getting our debt deeper and deeper, and then, let's raise more taxes, have more debt, raise more debt, have more debt. That's not a good place to be. But if we're being good stewards and lowering our debt ratio, and and then we're looking at what needs to be done, and we're factoring in doing some things as a city for housing and to draw more people in. But then at the end of the day, then we can really look at these assessments and go, okay, if it's a necessity and we're checking every other box and we're being good stewards here, well then yes, let's have it in the conversation. So that's why I appreciate finishing with this, because then showing us where we are at and how we are trying to be good stewards in the next, let's say, few years. So then it's worth having a conversation.
I appreciate that. But I point out, with the possible exception of user fees, nothing on this list funds the general operations of government. Everything here is specific to projects that people touching it benefit from.
Councilman Hoyer?
Well,
Yeah, you go
I'll
ahead.
go, Councilman.
I was just gonna, maybe just FYI, the CAPS bill that was in the legislative session last year, which is essentially the ability for municipalities to add an extra penny of a permanent third penny to fund long-term capital, seemingly making a return. So that's something we should keep an eye out for as well, which would cover a lot of what we're talking about here.
Before I go back to you, Councilman Hoyer, I'll just say, from my perspective, I think everything is on the table, provided, can we express why we're doing it? What are we doing this for the community? Because in the past, too often, the conversation has been, we're going to raise money here just so that we don't have to spend as much and we can spend more here. That's not going to sway me. But if you can sell me or have me try to sell others upon the vision of where we are going as a community, what this revenue stream would do for us, grasping the vision that we want as a community, the growth that we need, the housing that we need, because that is how you, I won't say permanently solve, but you fundamentally provide the structure to address the problems as they come up. And they are not ad hoc based upon, oh, well, let's raise assessment here so that we can, maybe take just a little bit of the burden off this fund, or we can spend more money here. It's insufficient planning based upon lack of a cohesive vision. So I think if we can get that full vision, I'd go to bat on any of these if I can be convinced in my head and then sell it to others as far as this is why we are doing it. I would just say, as an example, say street frontage assessment in my mind is basically a general obligation bond. You're taxing property owners, but I can at least see that because you're saying we are finding a revenue stream to address what used to be the number one complaint that we heard in the community. Fortunately, that is no longer, I think, even in the top 10 of things that I hear. And I don't want to go back to the time where that was, because that's a small town mindset. I think we've advanced beyond that. Let's just get to a point where everyone, you're always going to get complaints, but I don't want to go back to that time. But if we can sell people on, no, this is why we're doing it, because we don't want to have the cyclical variations in funding for the roads. We want to know the improvements that we're going to do, not only on existing roads, but upon future roads coming in. So that's Hoyer.
I would just toss out to looking back on our projects and stuff, really identifying the ones that are truly needs that drive the growth. Because those, in my head, should be probably the priorities that are going to be true, like quality of life needs. We can always get creative with some of the other ones that are more community amenity improvement and find maybe some user group collaboration where we can do more with it. But on top of it, just for lack of a better word, tightening our shot group too, just with accountability and some of the things that we do. I mean, I look at there's a period of development that we had in Watertown, for instance, where your sump pump is connected through your curb into the street. We don't allow you to discharge your stuff into the street, right? Is that currently how it's written?
You need a permit. Right. You can discharge the street, but you don't like going to the curb anymore.
But when I always think about it, because I grew up in the northeast part of town where you see specifically areas where the road erodes out from those never moving sump pump discharges. They just hit the same spot every time. And so we're taking out our own roads. Can we create programs that maybe incentivize correcting that so that we can create more longevity with our assets? But then, some of the things that I struggle with too is that while we look at new amenities, some of our systemic issues are that we build really cool things, but we have a lack of programming to go with them. And so we complete the project and that's great, but we don't leverage the thing that we made as much as we could. And again, that's not looking back on things and saying hey, we didn't do enough. It's just, how can we get creative with our use? How can we maybe better support Park and Rec to do more with some of these facilities? How do we better utilize City Auditorium to do more things that can drive revenue? Or even, the baseball stadium, how can we drive more revenue with that? But maybe doing a focus group that actually looks into, hey, what are some things that we could be doing with some of these spaces we already have that we're not considering? And we can maybe better leverage. And then maybe that can drive more revenue to fund some of these other things while we're focused on our actual needs to continue for growth. that make sense? Maybe that's just all over the place, but food for thought.
There's gonna be some items like on the council priority projects, the baseball stadium, we've got it in their second year. We've got to determine, is that one of those like a must, we've got to do something, or is there no baseball? So some of those items we really have to do bump up just because of the lease will be up, and then is there no baseball in town, or is it up to, or is there other ways to have baseball without us being involved? So some of those need to be up at least conversationally because of that timeline that we've established with the 3-year lease. Flood control, right? That's something, if we decide to keep moving forward, well, then we have to fund it. It's not even a discussion. So it's more how that looks. So then that kind of, that takes other things off the list pretty quick. So just a couple of those things that we got to be aware of, timelines.
I'd also just like to know that it's kind of on that too, the timeline of things. What's actually like an immediate threat versus something that feels immediate for maybe some groups, where we can still keep it on a back burner. It's not something that's going to ruin its use completely if we can't get to it right now. Just prioritizing, so maybe doing some triage essentially on what is a higher value, not higher value, but going back to the baseball, can baseball still happen at the stadium right now if we just extend out the lease, and then we can find a way creatively maybe to reach what we need to with that? Or, with Moss, like, granted you have a solution to that, but some of these other ones too, it's just like downtown.
It's a partial solution.
Okay.
I don't want to misrepresent.
But, finding the things that can still continue to function versus things that will just like tragically come to a halt. I even look at like Big Sioux flood control. While yes, we are looking at some solutions for that right now, we got through this year without any tragic flooding, which thank goodness. I'm glad that we didn't have a massive issue, but we've used Tesco bags in the past to get where we need to get to when it gets to a flood event. What are maybe some other things that we can do in the meantime to facilitate? Because that's a huge price tag. So unless we can get some federal dollars, it'll be a struggle.
Councilman Allen.
This is not so much having to do with those items, but earlier, Alan, you asked for maybe a small working group of council people to take a look at the priority projects and try and figure out if there are things that can be taken off, or at least put in the parking lot, or however we want to determine that. And my question is, so, okay, how do you want us to respond to that request? So if, are you talking about small working groups for specific projects, or a small working group for the overall piece of it? And I assume that any working group would involve staff sitting at the table with us to help us understand their perspective on things.
My thought on it, Councilman, was really to group some of the priorities into light type priorities, and ask for 2 or 3 cohorts of council members that have a passion for that particular grouping, and then to come back in the future with the entire group to report out on what those cohorts found and recommend. So that then,
so you'll send something out to us and say, here's kind of the groupings, who has an interest here, there, or whatever.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Just maybe chime in here quick. I guess the way I look at some of these priorities too is we've spent considerable amount of time and money on the street facility, and it would be a little crazy to me to not put that at the top of the priority list of some of these things we've spent a ton of time and effort on already. And maybe to say that a little bit differently, it would be not, I don't think, in the community's best interest to shelve things like the street facility and then bring in Cattail Crossing Clubhouse ahead of that, something we have no idea. And then we find out in a year that we don't want to do that. Now we've got plans for 2 that are on the shelf.
I would offer this, regardless of when you on further prioritization. We're not pulling back on the street facility. We've heard from this council and the prior council on the street facility as being the number one. So we'll continue to put effort into it. And I think we've got some effort on the east side fire as well, but there's a lot to determine before we get to go on it.
I think the list becomes easier if we knock a few of these off.
Yeah, agree.
So I think we can have Alan. I'd obviously welcome any conversation with any councilman, but I think next steps will be process what we heard today, identify what CPP things that you would be interested in. Basically just give it some thought, because, and possibly city manager, maybe do we want to group them out before we send them back out to council? Like personally, I could see grouping like Kettle, the clubhouse, the stadium, and Mace. Those are like projects.
I was actually thinking about putting the auditorium and water treatment in that same grouping.
Yeah. So that we could do some grouping before we get back to them, but would it be first beneficial to take the steps to eliminate the items listed here that are not going to gain any traction?
I think so. And so I would start with removing Compesca weeds. I think I'd also suggest removing buy down of debt at this point.
I would say, well, I'd be open to other people as well. The 50-meter pool is not something that Parks and Recreation desires, and it is a very nascent idea by the user group. I have met with them and I told them, you've got to make that gain traction. Meaning go raise money, awareness, whatever, because that's not, it's, and convince people on the ROI of that project. Gravel roads would be one that comes up occasionally. Seems to be very specific people who complain about them, living in very exact locations in town. I would have to be convinced as to the overall benefit to the community at large, as an example. But I don't want to, I'm just giving you a couple examples in my head where I would say these could probably be eliminated, and possibly what we could do is just say anything that's not in the top 10, you're out. Because it obviously didn't get enough of the votes from the past or current council to even make the top 10. It's a possibility, but I don't want to do that in case, because I could see an example where there could be a low cost combination of a group. You know, Director Rodick was saying, you know, he's got good ideas on the Mace and for very little cost. Up until a couple months ago, everyone was assuming we were looking at $5 million on that. So we don't want to necessarily throw something off the list if we can improve the situation on something that has been identified as something. If we could come up with an idea that maybe would be a low cost option, then we're not fearing it as a funding ask, just viewing it as an opportunity to improve the community. Councilman?
Mayor, would it be beneficial for us just to submit to Alan, these are things that we would say,
yeah,
could be moved off the list, and we'll send that to you, and that'll maybe help you then group
I
what's
think
left.
so.
That would be helpful. And then what I will do with that is probably email out a poll, your 1, 2, 3, in terms of which cohort you're most passionate about, and then get you guys organized.
Thank you.
I've got one thing. This is totally off subject, but October 14th, the WDC is doing their annual meeting. We have a work session that night. So the WDC meeting starts at 5, our work session starts at 4. I don't know if we're gonna be done in an hour, but it'd be nice to go to that. So should we consider moving the work session if we have it?
We actually, we suggested 2 dates for the work session, either the 14th or the 15th. The 13th is a holiday, so I would be fine going with the 15th if it works for you guys to go 2 consecutive nights.
I don't wanna pair it up. It'd be nice to go to that and listen in, so.
We will schedule it for the 15th.
Sounds good.
City manager, anything else? Anything else?
This was very helpful. Thank you. for
Any
putting this
future
together.
council items to be read ahead? Any public comment? Oh, anyone? Okay. Any outside comments, any council? Okay. We have no reason to go into executive session that I'm aware of. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, by Councilman Allen, seconded by Councilman Peters. All those in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion carries.